Again, thank you so much for being here, but it's really my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Liat Naeh. She's a scholar and a museum professional focusing on the art and archaeology of the ancient Middle East during the Bronze and Iron Ages. She's particularly interested in Levantine artistic practices and ideology in an age of global exchange with the Mediterranean, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. She has published extensively on Levantine bone and ivory carving and ritualistic furniture, and is the co-editor of a recent volume on thrones in the ancient world. Dr. Naeh is currently researching 20th century displays of biblical archaeology within museum exhibitions in Israel and beyond. Prior to joining the University of Toronto Archaeology Center as a research associate, Dr. Naeh was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and also at the Bard Graduate Center, which are both in New York City. And Dr. Naeh's talk today is entitled "The Lion Strikes Twice: Levantine-Styled Game Boxes, Style Game Boxes, and Visuality of Myth." So thank you so much, Dr. Naeh, for being here, and we really look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. Let me start by sharing my screen. Hopefully it works well. So is this okay? You guys are seeing my screen, hopefully?
We can see it. It looks great.
Thank you. Okay. So I would like to open by deeply thanking the Archaeology Center at the University of Toronto for generously providing me with an academic home for the duration of this COVID year. And especially Professor Edward Swenson, thank you, the director of the Archaeology Center. I'm also very grateful to Dr. Hilary Duke for her ongoing support. Today, I'm so excited to share with you some results of my ongoing project about the cultural meaning of Levantine-styled game boxes, reflecting my training in archaeology and art history. In many ways, this project builds on my broader interest in bone and ivory art during the Bronze and Iron Ages in the ancient Middle East, and also my ongoing endeavors to define Levantine material culture in an age of intercultural encounters. I am particularly excited to share this work in progress with the members of the Archaeology Center, as I am eager to get your perspective on this challenging and perhaps somewhat familiar issue of trying to identify the initial local meaning of a portable object that is now far better known by its exportation abroad, through its being exchanged and traded, to the point of obscuring its role in its own culture of origin. Let's see. Okay. During the second millennium BCE, at the cusp of an international art age, a group of objects stands out: the well-known bone and ivory inlaid game boxes found all around the Eastern Mediterranean Basin, featuring the boards of the games of 20 Squares and Senet. I call these containers Levantine-styled game boxes. Here we see a superbly preserved specimen, and you'll immediately notice that this particular box is not from the Levant, but from Egypt, which is highly indicative of the issues we will face today. In yet another example from Camille Deleu's Lebanon, we can see that the boxes were adorned by distinct imagery of animal hunt scenes showing lions or dogs chasing ungulates. Curiously, the animal scenes were always doubled, yet included a subtle difference between two iterations. In this way, I argue, the Levantine artist meant to capture nuances of time and space, to prolong a fleeting moment when potentially both the predator and the prey may have still prevailed. In the study of ancient Middle Eastern art, we tend to view such animal chase and hunt scenes as rather universal metaphors for the rivalry between the two players of board games. Yet in this talk, I will emphasize that what we also witness here is a Levantine practice of repetition with variation, a visual version of the poetic language of West-Semitic myth and ritual. I consider such a poetic mode of depiction to complement the religious role of the game of 20 squares, which the Levantines actually employed to predict the future. I will further argue that the Levantine-style game boxes were object of syncretism, matching Egyptian and Levantine beliefs, and therefore serving as somewhat of a Rosetta Stone to some little understood tenets of Levantine faith and artistic practice. So let us begin our journey today by orienting ourselves chronologically and geographically. We will focus on the 2nd millennium BCE, a period that we often refer to as the Middle and Late Bronze Ages in the ancient Middle East. At the time, the southern Levant, the area covering modern-day Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, was in many ways continuous to the northern Levant, covering modern-day Lebanon and Syria. This is the area also known as the coast of West Asia and is part of the Eastern Mediterranean Basin. The southern Levant is the area familiar to most of us as biblical Canaan. Yet the biblical term Canaanites poses considerable difficulties when juxtaposed with other textual evidence and archaeological excavations. We do not know how the inhabitants of the area referred to themselves during the 2nd millennium BCE, or if there were a single social system that governed them politically. To simplify what is a highly complex discussion, I will say that during the 2nd millennium BCE, the people of the Levant lived in city-states dominated by a local elite class that built monumental temples and palaces, and were in contact with ancient Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, the area of modern-day Iraq. As far as can be judged, each Levantine city had its own ruler, who is likely to have supervised the production of large luxury artifacts within the city's royal workshop. What we must keep in mind is that the Levant always formed a bridge between Mesopotamia and Egyptian cultures, leading scholars to conceive of Levantine artistic practices in somewhat blurry terms, as being overwhelmingly influenced and subordinated to neighboring empires. With this problem in mind, much of my ongoing work, including the project presented today, attempts to pinpoint what is unique to the southern Levant with the aim of better illuminating its own religion and ideology. During the later stages of the Middle Bronze and early Late Bronze Ages, a seemingly standardized, coherent group of boxes emerged in the Levant, spreading around the Eastern Mediterranean Basin. The boxes appear to have become widespread in the Levant during the 17th or 16th century BCE, remaining in use during the 15th century BCE. And while most of the known examples arrived from the Levant, I started by saying that there were also complete and fragmented boxes excavated in Egypt and Cyprus, which are also often thought to represent the works of Levantines. The best preserved boxes of the group feature double boards, with one side serving as the board of 20 Squares, a game with a long history in Mesopotamia, and the other one serving as the board of the game of Senet, which is better known as an Egyptian game. So even though such boxes were fragile composite objects that mostly did not survive archaeologically, thanks to these exceptional examples, we have a surprisingly clear idea of how other boxes must have looked like. All Levantine-styled game boxes were wooden brick-shaped containers, mostly adorned by rectangular bone inlays, and on some occasions, ivory. The inlays were incised by typical scenes portraying animal chase and hunt, situated in a landscape marked by one tree or several plants. The standardization of the Levantine-styled game boxes is therefore evident not only by their imagery, but also by their similar size, shape, materials, and overall design. Moreover, the function of the boxes was highly standardized. Almost each box included both types of games. Such game boxes must have been used times and again in everyday life, yet they are best known from excavations of tombs. We imagine these game boxes to be coveted, well-crafted objects of luxury and conspicuous consumption, traveling outside the Levant and appreciated in Egypt and Cyprus. Yet such a commercial interpretation does not explain the original importance of the boxes in the Levant itself. The first excavated example of a Levantine-styled game box seems to have originated from Tel Bet Mirsim, where about 20 inlays were reconstructed as a single-sided box with a 20 squares board, used in a so-called palace or patrician house. Among the most notable inlays from around the palace were two rectangular inlays which were incised with ungulates. One of the inlays featured an ungulate and a flying gallop, facing left towards a stylized branch of tree. Another inlay shows an ungulate with typical hint of a smile, skipping to the right, facing a similar plant, this time cut in half. A rectangular inlay from Bet She'an, roughly dated to the Middle Bronze or Late Bronze Age I, and possibly kept later as an heirloom, seems to have also once belonged to a Levantine-styled game box. Here, an ungulate at the right of the inlay is seen crouching, head looking behind. It is unaware of a threatening lion, who is sitting lurking in the left corner, open-jawed, his face exuding mass. Between them are what may be stylized and irregular schematic plants. The animals, in this case dotted by typical brisk incisions, were pushed against the outer frame of the rectangular inlay. The proportions and dimension of the Bet She'an inlay may indicate that it too may have once adorned a board of 20 squares. Some of the most diverse examples of inlays arrive from Khutzor, again from a late Bronze Age context. Building 7050 on the Acropolis, thought to be either a temple or a palace of the late Bronze Age date, yielded hundreds of artifacts of metal, stone, and skeleton material, many of them heirlooms from the Middle Bronze Age. One such rectangular inlay depicts a chase about to take place. A recumbent lion is seen in the left of the plane. He is spread along the inlay surface, paws and head pushing against the rim, and tail curled. His muzzle, with an ever so slight hint of a typical smile, is facing the head of an ungulate, eye to eye. The lion and what may be another now erased animal next to him were both dotted with the typical incisions of the style along the fur. To the left of the lion behind him are short oblique lines that may indicate half of a schematic plant. And like in Tel Bet Mirsim, building 7050, used by the elites in either ceremony or ritual, must have once held multiple boxes of this type. And perhaps the most well-known example of Levantine-styled game boxes, and the ones best preserved for sure, originated from the so-called treasury house in Kamidelos in modern-day Lebanon. Boxes 519 and 536 were found in this context that, perhaps not unlike Khutzor's building 7050, also housed rich artifacts made of alabaster, faience, ivory, and metal, as well as Egyptian and Cypriot imports. Also being a double 20 square and Senet boxes, their impeccable preservation allows us better to understand the relationship between individual panels with the same scene repeated. Sorry, just finding my spot here. Individual panels on top boxes. Okay, here flanking the board of 20 squares that are two elongated rectangular inlays with the same scene repeated in two distinct movements in time. A canine-looking predator with pointed ears, perhaps a dog, wolf, or hyena, is about to pounce an ungulate who is resting alongside a tree. once again seen cut in half. The predator is similar to a Canaan associated with the game of Senet in Egypt and other games in Egypt, and represented on Egyptian throw sticks. And we already know that Levantine-style boxes were also exported outside the Levant. A slightly different example arrives from Thebes in Egypt. One side of the box features the game of 20 squares, while the other features the 30 squares of the game of Senet. The inner drawer seemed to have held the game pieces. Here, the inlays were probably made of ivory, not bone, and were set in a wooden infrastructure that did not survive. Flanking the ladder of 20 squares are elongated inlays featuring yet another variant of the animal chase and hunt scene. In one of the panels, we see a couple of animals facing each other. A recumbent lion, his innocent face with a hint of a smile, is facing an animal in midst of flying gallop, heading towards him. This latter animal is enigmatic, with its non-feline features, drooping ears, a narrow muzzle, no indication of a mouth, and with its short tail, leading some to view it as a dog. The scene may portray a combat about to take place rather than a hunt. Indeed, on inlays from other sites, the smiling recumbent lion was usually shown about to pounce its prey, and it is a prey that was typically seen in a flying gallop. Yet here the lion is faced by another carnivore. The second panel, shows one of these preying animals, probably the dog with its erected tail and wide open muzzle, ready to swallow two ungulates. The Theban box therefore adds another variant to the plot sequence within the Levantine-styled game boxes. The moment when the hunter, the lion, becomes threatened by the dog. While the box was excavated in Egypt, most scholars agree that it is of Levantine style. And finally, a particularly well-preserved and well-known example, a partially preserved but well-known, arrives from an elite building of a later date of the 14th century in Enkomi, Cyprus, seemingly belonging to a game of 20 squares, and is part of a set of two similar boards. Here we may wonder if the panels reflect the same moment in time, perhaps shown from two mirroring points of view, or whether there is also a temporal progression with the lower panel showing the lion only approaching the ungulate and the upper panel showing the lion now almost reaching its prey. To me, perhaps the most striking feature of the Levantine-style game boxes is how they depict these animals in hunt scenes. The scene is shown twice, each flanking the so-called ladder of the game of 20 squares, and never the board of Senet, which is also found in the same box. And perhaps more importantly, always with a slight variation between the two reiterations of the same scene. Sometimes it seems like the scene is shown in two distinct consecutive moments in time. A moment before the predator pounces its prey, and a moment when it is ever so close to devour its prey. On other examples, it seems like the same scene is shown from two different perspectives, 2 points of view overlooking the same space where the hunt scene is about to occur. Are we meant to follow a narrative, to be mesmerized by a looming threat of the predator gradually approaching its prey? Or are we rather meant to pause through a sense of delay and suspense? Either way, the boxes always leave this tension unresolved. Will the lion seize the ungulate, or will the ungulate escape? As far as the viewers can see, the images on the Levantine-style game boxes always allow us to imagine both outcomes as possible, death or life. At this point, I should confess that we have no concrete evidence that these boxes were actually manufactured in the Levant or by Levantines. There are, however, some strong indications to suggest that these inlaid boxes were part of a Levantine artistic tradition. I will mention these only briefly, pointing that the majority of the inlays adorned by these typical animal chase and hunt scenes were found in the Levant rather than in Egypt or the Aegean, and that their iconography and style fits well with other Levantine objects. More importantly, building on my dissertation on Levantine geometric styled bone inlays, I can state that the Levantine-style game boxes were inseparable from different types of bone inlaid boxes that were manufactured in the Levant. And some of them are well anchored within Levantine workshops and are directly related to the manufacture and consumption of the Levantine-style game boxes. And yet another way of considering the boxes as Levantine is through their comparison with Egyptian game boxes. It is usually suggested that the game of 20 squares arrived from the Levant into Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, during the 17th dynasty. In addition to the Levantine-style double-faced boxes that made their way into Egypt, and we saw one from Thebes, the Egyptians soon created their own similar versions of double-faced boards and boxes, combining the two games together, but with a completely different approach to their artistic program. Unlike the Levantine-styled game boxes, the Egyptian examples were adorned by hieroglyphs and inscriptions and bore the images of their owners. These Egyptian versions became increasingly popular in Egypt during the New Kingdom period, but must have maintained something of their Levantine heritage, as the hieroglyph inscriptions on them indicate that the Egyptian boxes always showed the foreign game of 20 squares on top, rather than the local game of Senet, which was on the bottom. So let us now pause and reflect. We have depicted these boxes as Levantine products that spread all over the Mediterranean basin, owing to their global appeal as prestigious elite goods. But what was their role within the Levant? To understand this, let us now consider the box's double function, together with their unique pictorial program. The boxes combined two race games, both meant for two players, 20 Squares and Senet. The game of 20 Squares seems to have had a long history in Mesopotamia and in Iran, already during the 3rd millennium BCE, with similar versions found in the so-called royal tomb of Ur that we will soon see. The game resurfaced in the Mari Palace during the 18th century BCE. At the same time, it flourished in the southern Levant and probably immediately found its way to Egypt, the Aegean, and Anatolia. And the rules of the game of 20 squares remain somewhat unclear. Two participants were apparently made to move 5 gaming pieces around along the board, which was divided into 3 rows, each of 4, 12, and 4 squares. Players captured the rival pawns by landing on a square that they have already occupied, and the movement of the pawns was usually determined by casting astragali bones. And you're all encouraged to play the many versions that are available to you online with these speculated rules in mind. So what is truly remarkable is that in certain Levantine contexts, the game of 20 squares was not only a leisurely pastime, but was a religious practice. The game's religious role is best illuminated through the incision of game boards on liver models during the 2nd millennium BCE from Levantine sites such as Bet She'an, Hamid el-Lawz. Clay models of livers were common in Mesopotamia and Levantine cultures. They served as manuals for deciphering the signs read on the actual livers of butchered animals, oftentimes domesticated ungulates such as sheep and goats. Livers were believed to predict the future and served as a guide in royal, religious, and medicinal decision-making. Liver models were therefore covered with cuneiform inscriptions indicating what each shape and bump in any given liver may predict. And it is therefore profoundly meaningful that on some Levantine liver models, these divination manuals, on them, priests outlined a board of the game of 20 squares. They must have correlated specific omens foretold by means of haruspicy, divination based on entrails, with the chance progression of the game of 20 squares. So we may imagine that the tossing of astragali and the landing on specific squares on the board were read as an indication of specific events to come, of omens, either good or bad, just like the signs read on ungulate livers. Thus, Levantines may have used a game of 20 squares to communicate with the gods. The religious importance of the game of 20 squares becomes further elucidated through its association with the game of Senet, a game that is known to have had profound religious importance in Egypt. In this regard, the Levantine-styled game boxes offer us a rare glimpse into practices of syncretism of Levantine and Egyptian cultures, seeing as in certain contexts in both the Levant and in Egypt, the use and meaning of the game of 20 squares became equated with that of the game of Senet, uniting them into a single object. The Egyptian game of Senet, also known as the game of 30 houses, was common in Egypt from around the 4th millennium BCE and found its way to the Levant from as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. And like the game of 20 squares, the game of Senet was a race game designed for 2 players. Players traditionally used throw sticks to determine their moves, with each of the players moving 7 or 5 playing pieces across the board. The goal of the game was to block or remove the play pieces of the opponent and to outspeed them to the end of the board. As a favorite pastime, Senet was included in Egyptian burials long before the New Kingdom period, as were many other functional and luxurious items that were meant to serve the dead for all eternity. But at least as late as the Middle Kingdom, it was perceived as a medium for the dead and the living to communicate with each other, to play together, and from as late as the New Kingdom period, it was further perceived not only as a metaphor for the progression of the deceased through the underworld, but also as a ritualized magical practice of ensuring that the soul of the deceased would reach eternal life. Just as the player would fight the opponent, the soul would fight evil forces in the underworld for a happy afterlife. A loss could therefore lead to an annihilation of the soul. This interpretation is based not only on hieroglyph inscriptions on the boards of Senet excavated from Egyptian tombs, but also on wall paintings within the tombs, showing the dead playing the game, and is mostly based on the appearance of Senet games in the Book of the Dead, marking the arduous journey of the deceased and the judging of the soul to determine its fate. Thus, winning the game would allow the players Ba, an element of their soul, to become reunited with the sun god Re, and then reborn daily like the rising sun. In scholarship, the Levantines are usually the ones attributed with the invention of the double-faced hybrid game box, converging the Mesopotamian Levantine game of 20 squares together with the Egyptian game of Senet. Yet here I further argue that this was actually an act of Levantine syncretism between the religious meaning of Senet in Egypt and the prophetic aspects of the game of 20 squares in the Levant that were meaningful. Let's keep this religious syncretism in mind as we return to examine the box's artistic program, now with a fresh eye. So animal chases and combats are probably among the most prevalent and multivalent artistic themes in ancient Near Eastern, Egyptian, and overall Eastern Mediterranean art. They appear on a range of objects, including weapons and furniture and seals. And as noted by Marian Feldman, it is such a widely shared theme that must have played different roles as it moved between cultures and periods. Being so common and so fluid, it seems almost ill-advised to force one specific interpretation to such animal scenes. For now, let us keep in mind that in the context of the game boxes, animal chase and hunt scenes lend themselves to be read as symbols for the rivalry between players, but also, in some cases, for the battle between kings or mythological rivalries. One particular nuance that I would like to further mention relates to gender. While the lion is mostly associated with the male king, it is also the animal of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. And while the ungulate can be associated with female elements, it can also be related to male gods. According to Wee, some second millennium texts from Emar, Syria, possibly concerning the game of 20 squares in the context of divination, mention male and female elements. And here we see a later example from Egypt with the rivalry between the playing lion and ungulate expressed satirically through a sexual narrative, with the lion symbolizing the male and the ungulate standing for the female. In light of my following analysis to the pictorial program of the Levantine-Styled Game Boxes, I cannot help but think that such male-female duality of the animal rivalry may have been deeply related to specific ideas of life, death, and rebirth in the context of both games. Yet, rather than focusing on the iconography of the animal scene, I believe the box's formalistic and compositional aspects are the key to their decipherment. Why was the image always repeated twice on each object, with a slight variation between the two images? I have posited that this conveyed that the outcome of the rivalry was undecided. Now we will further argue that such a visual repetition was not only appropriate for adorning game boxes, but is also reflective of Levantine language of epic myth and ritual, as known to us from surviving West-Semitic texts, especially poetry. By this, I do not mean to imply that the Levantine-style game boxes are illustrations of Levantine texts, but rather that by repeating the animal scenes, the boxes feature formalistic elements that we also know from Levantine literature, and thus express a meaningful cultural mode of expression. Ritualistic repetition is a primary hallmark of Levantine poetry and key to its rhetoric. When employed in poetry, scholars tend to read such reiteration as creating a sense of pace, a sense of continuity, marking the progression of time, and intentionally creating suspense, and at the same time engaging the reader and anchoring the narrative as it unfolds and progresses. The well-known Ugaritic texts, mythical texts discovered at the Syrian port city of Ugarit, mostly put to the writing during the 13th century BCE, are probably the most significant source we currently have for the study of the religious life of the Levantines during the second millennium. Within Ugaritic mythical poetry, whole scenes, paragraphs, speeches, and sentences are repeated over and over, framing the dramatic narrative. Such a custom of reiterating text immediately underlines the visual redoubling of the animal chase and hunt scene within the Levantine-styled game box. In fact, the Levantine authors often repeated the same verses with slight changes. In some cases, while the text recurs word for word, the context of the text in the story changes, therefore creating a fresh perspective and progressing the narrative. In other cases, Ugaritic poetry includes the repetition of an idea twice into consecutive verses, or in more, as we see here, by using synonyms and parallels. And this is the example that we see here. This, I would argue, is exactly what we see in the Levantine-style game boxes. The same scene rendered with a slight variation is equatable with the same verse repeated through synonyms and parallels. I believe such repetition through variation must have held a ritualistic meaning, both verbally and visually. If the Levantine-styled game boxes employ modes of representation that are borrowed from the language of ritual or myth, what was the ritual or myth in question? While I am certain that this reiteration stems from mythical modes of expression, I am not sure I can determine what myth was represented. I believe it must have been inherently linked with the ideas of life, death, and rebirth discussed until now, in light of the syncretism between funerary meanings of Senet and the use of 20 squares in Levantine divination. And reading the iconography of lions, ungulates, and perhaps also dogs, I am tempted to consider a connection between Levantine-styled game boxes and the myth of the rivalry between Baal, the Levantine god of fertility and life and natural renewal, and Mot, the Levantine god of death. In the text of Ugarit, put to writing centuries after the boxes were used, but undoubtedly based on much earlier traditions, Mot, the Levantine god of death, is in fact represented as a devourer, and more specifically as a ravenous, ferocious lion. Message of the son of El Mot, word of the beloved of El, the warrior. My throat is the throat of the lion of the steppe, the appetite of the dolphin in the sea. It seeks the pool as wild bovids do, seeks the spring like a herd of deer. Mot is not only the god of death and the lord of the underworld. His throat is also envisioned as a physical entryway, a portal to the underworld. The idea that the god of death hungers for flesh, that it appears as a lion and hunts like a lion in a field, is well developed in Ugaritic texts, and its elaboration allows for some more nuanced discussion of Mot's stereomorphic features. For example, Mot's mouth, pe, and throat, kane, are described as wide open so as to swallow its prey. Thinking of the Levantine-styled game boxes, we may match this description on the open mouth of the predator with the moment described on some of the Levantine-styled game boxes when the lion is opening its mouth wide to the sight of its approaching prey or unsuspecting prey. Other passages from Ugaritic myth bring in greater detail the location where Mot, the god of death, awaits its prey, the desert, a liminal portal between the land of life and the land of death. In a pleasant land at the outbreak, in a beautiful field in the realm of death. Other times, the same so-called beautiful field is revealed to be a wasteland, a desert, where the hungry moth roams like a lion, waiting to prey on Baal. I arrived at the pleasant place, the steppe land, at the beautiful field in the realm of death. I approached mightiest Baal. I took him like a lamb in my mouth, crushed him like a kid in the chasm of my throat. And here you can really get a sense of this repetition through variation in its poetic use. In the Levant, the idea of the symbolic fight of life and death is therefore indeed conceived in terms of a lion hunting its prey, an ungulate. The language used in this paragraph further illustrates, once again, how the verses repeat information twice, accentuating a slight variation. The pleasant place in the first line becomes a beautiful field in the second line. Took him like a lamb becomes crushed like a kid. And indeed, this is the parallelism so identified with West-Semitic language of myth. I therefore regard these references from Ugaritic literatures as keys to the decipherment of both the themes of the boxes, the animal chase and hunt, and as a key in solving the logic behind repeating the same scene twice, always with its slight variation between reiterations. It is an expression of the language of myth and ritual. The afterlife of the Levantine-styled game boxes sheds further light on their unparalleled uniqueness. The practice of creating and exchanging game boxes and decorating them with animal chase and hunt scenes preserved through the late Bronze Age too, a time when the exchange between the courts of the Eastern Mediterranean Basin was in its fullest bloom. The Levantine-styled game boxes are therefore often suggested to be one of the first categories of objects to embody the emerging international style, which during the late Bronze Age too became a hallmark of a shared international elite practice. Certainly, the Levantine-styled game boxes belong to the advent of such late Bronze Age artistic movements as Egyptianizing and the art of the international style. Nevertheless, I would stress that as these late Bronze Age artistic movements matured, the Levantine-styled game boxes all but disappeared. New examples were made of ivory rather than bone and included royals on chariots, as we see here in a very famous ivory game box from Enkumi. They included charging lions and flying griffins, and those iconographies were no longer repeated ritually through variation. We may consider how, in the process of globalization, in a global economy that hungered for art objects that defy cultural labels, the Levant-styled game boxes would have been casted aside for being overly Levantine, for a lack of a better word, too heavily encoded with specific cultural and even religious legacies. We imagine Levantine manufacturers and Levantine patrons falling out of grace over the centuries leading to the height of the late Bronze Age. And we are struck by how, during a process of globalization, the world may have lost a Levantine vernacular art form. We now arrive to our summary. According to the archaeological information available to us today, the Levantine-styled game boxes emerged as a standardized group of artifacts in the Eastern Mediterranean Basin sometime during the final stages of the Middle Bronze Age and continued to be in use by the Late Bronze Age I. Some of the leading examples include the ones from Tel Bet Milsin, Bet She'an, Khatsor, Kamidelos, Thebes, and Enkumi, revealing that the boxes were coveted far beyond the Levant. In fitting with the Levantines' role of bridging between Mesopotamia and Egypt, they included a syncretism of two games, the Egyptian Senet and the Mesopotamian game of 20 squares. Indeed, who was better than the Levantines at stitching together such intercultural hybrids? Yet I've argued that this marrying of the two games is not merely a commercial innovation, but should be interpreted as a religious one, relating to the role of these two games in communicating with the dead and divination. This, I maintain, further explained the specific choice of the Levantines to include two reiterations of the animal chase and hunt scene, flanking the latter of the game of 20 squares. This was, I believe, a visual form of the well-known poetic repetition with variation related to the roles of Baal and Mot as gods of life and death, envisioned here as a devouring lion and as an ungulate. Thus, both the theme of the image, the animal chase and hunt, and the mode of artistic rendering, this repetition of the animal scene but with a slight variation, appears to me as an attestation of a Levantine practice, which is well known to us from modes of Levantine narrative in texts. In a side note, I will add that this must have been, there must have been a profound connection between the carving of ungulate bones to create the inlays of the game boxes and the divination based on ungulate entrails. Here we have a visual and materialistic message that the Levantines must have encoded, intended to be grasped by Levantines, and while left in plain sight, some of its meaning may not have been necessarily privy to outsiders. We are left to marvel at the designer's mastery of religious education and profound internalizing of mythic forms rather than only iconography. I therefore consider the boxes to offer us a new understanding of oral or written traditions in the Levant, religious rite, and intercultural syncretism. And I thank you very, very much. So let me now stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really
Thank you.
fascinating.
Thanks.
There's some questions. I'm sure they're questions. Oh, Alexa, great. Thanks so much. You're on.
Hi, Dr. Naeh. Thank you for the great talk. It was very fascinating. I was curious, I really liked the thread throughout your talk about dualism and about syncretism. And I was curious about carrying forward this idea of a duality and trying to sort of think through the possibility of who would be playing this game, like their gender identities, their status identities. And I was wondering if you have a sense from your analysis and even the curation of the boxes from the game pieces that are either preserved within the boxes themselves or the actual structure of the boxes, if you have a sense of what some of those patterns might be and would be able to comment on that, of sort of the identity of the players themselves.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent question. My first instinct is to say that I wish we had that information archaeologically. So I'm thinking of the earlier geometric style bone inlaid boxes that I mentioned that I studied in a previous research. And those from the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age were always suspected to be belonging to women because there are like trinket boxes, or that's the way they were thought of in scholarship. So it's very tempting to think of boxes as holding precious items that may have belonged to specifically to women. But I'm not sure we have any indication of that. What I think we should keep in mind is that these sort of boxes must have been used over and over during the lifetime of people must have been passed down through the generations, and eventually found their way into the tomb. So I'm assuming that even though these boxes bear this very specific mythical language, they were still used for pastime by probably all genders. I'm just assuming, I have no indication otherwise. What we saw later with this satirical papyrus from Dir el-Medina in Egypt is, I'm not really sure how to fit that in to the Levantine narrative, because it is a later Egyptian, really a form of a joke. But it is revealing that we can think of the lion and the ungulate as representing men and women. So it's interesting to keep that in mind. For me, it really resonated with what I'm looking at in terms of life and death. So the male and female creating life. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexa. Are there other questions for Dr.
Well, it looks like there's a question in chat.
Oh, yes, great.
So it says, were these boxes mentioned in Levantine texts? Did Levantines leave any written documents indicating what they thought of them?
Thank you so much, Ziad. I can only dream of such a scenario. That would be like the best thing that to ever happen if I could find an indication of the Levantines mentioning the boxes. I have no knowledge of such written documentation. In a way, what I've tried to argue in this talk with this very sort of step-by-step connection between the material object and the written documentation is the most direct way I can find of connecting this object with any sort of text. But I will add that in the study of the second millennium, especially in the international age of the height of the late Bronze Age, there is always this hope of making a match between specific objects that are included in inventory lists or in dowry lists and lists of gifts that are shipped from royal court to royal court. And there's always this hope of matching them with specific objects. But those sort of matches always remain a bit speculative, but still, ideally, maybe in the future, we will be able to find that text mentioning the boxes. That will be really nice.
Thank you. We have another question from Nadine. She asks, does this Levantine style of repetition with slight variation appear in other art forms?
So thank you, Nadine. I have prepared a slide especially for this very good question. May I share that again? Let's try.
Yes, great.
Thank you. So there's some things that I really wanted to talk about, but I just didn't have the space. So this is such a famous stele made of basalt found in Bethshan. And what you can really see here is repetition with variation. So it's very sort of conspicuous how it presents these two moments. And it's always a bit of a guessing game who these characters are. But I think you can see here a lion and possibly the dog that I was mentioning before. That's perhaps questionable. But what this tells me is that we should be keeping our eyes open and looking for, first of all, monumental art, such as this very unique basalt stele. Also, probably other forms of art. We should be looking for those reiteration through variation that we haven't been paying attention to thus far, but apparently they're all around us. So I guess another thing I would like to add in this context is that the boxes are from the middle of the Middle Bronze Age. So anytime from the 18th century, maybe till the 14th century. That sort of, it's a bit difficult because those later examples are actually not from the Levant, so it's confusing. But the Ugaritic texts, what I relied on in making this connection of reiteration with variation, those texts are later, right? They were put to writing in the 13th century. So we imagine these two parallel lines with this artistic tradition perhaps being cut short sometime in this transition between Middle Bronze and Late Bronze Age, maybe, while the poetic tradition employing this reiteration with variation continues on. So I believe it will find all these new visual ways that also explore such reiteration with variation, but maybe some of those visual traditions are new or are starting over. So maybe it's not a linear sort of progression.
Thank you, Dr. Naeh. There's some additional questions? Oh, yes, Anne, please. Thank you.
Hi, Liat. It's lovely to see you, and thank you so much for a really deeply informed talk, quite fascinating. I'm wondering, given the chronological distribution of the boxes versus the text, whether we might not see the illustrations giving rise to the images in the texts rather than the other way around. I see in the third millennium a sort of similar situation, images that really we want to be able to connect to various texts for a lot of different reasons, are actually earlier than the texts. And so might it not be that the pictures are creating ideas about the characters that we see in the texts?
So really, thank you for that. That is an excellent point. I don't think we are able to really explain what came first. I tend to think of both visual and textual traditions or oral traditions as just stemming from this uber tradition that we don't know when it started. So I'm always assuming that there is a missing piece of information that maybe the source of these traditions that could be both visual and literature. But yes, again, I think it's really true. I'm using a later textual form to, perhaps I should say, shed light on this visual tradition rather than illustrate it. I understand this very nuanced point that you're making, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm not sure if I should just read.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I was unmuted. You want to read it? Go ahead, if you like. Do you see it in the chat?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so there's a question from Fan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Which body of anthropological literature or on mythology, such as those by Levi-Strauss, will you be citing in your analysis of mythology? Is there anything interesting or relevant in the numbering appearing in the games, such as 24? So these are excellent questions. So to the first part, I will answer that I'm afraid I don't have any specific anthropological literature on mythology that I rely on. I'm not there yet, but I would love to hear your suggestions. I'm arriving to this not as an anthropologist per se, but really as an art historian and archaeologist. So I have to say I'm very much entrenched in the Levantine culture, and I should really be getting out there and be familiarizing myself more with current anthropological literature. So thank you for that. And about the numbers, so it's a fascinating subject. So in Senet, we do know that each and every one of the squares had, in later context, a lot of symbolic information, symbolic meaning. And we don't have that same sort of resolution of information about the game of 20 squares. But there must have been a meaning to each and every one of the numbers. And there is this sort of mystical body of knowledge about, each and every one of the Mesopotamian gods having their own number, and numerology was part of that. So it could be interesting to find correlations between the numbers of the squares and their specific meaning and divination, but we're not there yet. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these boxes, even though they're similar and different, they must have had some sort of standardized scale. So we have the extant boxes, the ones that are really well preserved, are usually about 25, 26 centimeters in length. So it's interesting to think of the meaning of that size, which is related to specific measures in Egypt and elsewhere, but I won't go into that now. But thank you so much for those good questions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because I'm just thinking, because you're talking about a repetition and variation, which clearly from poetry. But I was just thinking, Claude Levi-Strauss wrote about in his mythological, because he associates those with paintings and with classical music as well. So there's a lot of common point in terms of, but he's very complex in that way. And also that spatial distribution. Thank you very much. That's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be sure to return to my Levi-Strauss. There's always, it's always useful to go back to the classics. Thank you.
Thank you, Fawn, for that question. Are there any other queries? I think I could maybe add to that. I really enjoyed the piece, and I think it serves as a reminder. If I can interject some anthropology, certainly Levi-Strauss is into dualisms and metaphoric couplets, but I think your paper nicely shows that religion does not function simply as an instrument of social management, say in the spirit of Durkheim, or political control as Marx would have it. Ritual practice also constitutes a fundamental technology, if I can call it that, that's wielded to grapple with the unknown and the indeterminate. And that's what I see beautifully encapsulated on these game boards, as issues of the uncertain, the unknown, the indeterminate, the tension between the ungulate and the lion. What will the outcome be? And of course, that's what games are like. So I don't have so much a question, but I think, you could take this in very interesting ways, and we certainly see parallels in other traditions. The Maya ball game provides a really interesting example, for instance, where this was a huge gambling culture around the ball game as well, but it had very deep cosmological religious meanings. I mean, each iteration of the ball game was, in a sense, a reenactment of world creation. It was kind of a cosmogonic rite, if you will. And I'm even thinking also of the Chinese oracle bones, which are very interesting. It also has that weird materiality of the animal bone, of the, whether it's the shell of the tortoise or the, the scalpulae of bovines. But there's many who argue that, the Chinese writing itself originates from divination. I think it was Carlos Ginzburg who argued that semiotics itself, how we read and understand and interpret signs, to really better grasp and pose some order on an unknown world, originated in Babylonian divination. So again, I don't have so much a question, but I can comment on what I found to be a really fascinating paper that aligns very well with some kind of new directions and how rituals understood. Malinowski and Solons, who really do think it is a way of trying to make sense of a world that's hard to understand at times. We can relate in this pandemic age, in a sense. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I would love to follow up on those ideas. This is actually, it could be a really fascinating dialogue for me to learn from, and I'm very grateful for that. Yeah, I mean, I'm particularly struck by how accidental our knowledge of this divination associated with the game of 20 squares is. I mean, without those two very clear examples on clay models from the Levant, I'm not sure we would be able to create a strong case for the use of 20 squares in divination. And it's really through these sort of piecing the little pieces of the puzzle together, pointing to the clay livers and explaining how this was matched with the meaning of Senet, which is much more well documented. Then we can slowly, step by step, start talking about this behind the scenes meaning of the religious use of the game. And in the Levant, there's always this longing for scholars we always wish there was more text explaining what the Levantines were thinking and doing, and we really have so little to work with, which is a bit absurd, thinking that this was you know, the place where a lot of our written traditions started, but we just don't have enough information about the religious meaning that the Levantines attributed to their own artistic practices.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. And I noticed Anne Porter also mentioned that perhaps writing in Mesopotamia also originated in divination. So thanks for that. Wasn't maybe just boring accounting, you know. Yeah, and I think it's also intriguing how you have the dualism in the game, that perhaps, you know, you would throw lots or something to see what game to even play. That I find really fascinating. So there's
Yes.
this netting of dual possibilities, one alternative or another. So really cool stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think we had one of our world tops game expert here in the audience, and Don Vettery from the Metropolitan Museum, but I think she said goodbye, I think. But yeah, there are these ancient game geniuses who have just encyclopedic information about every aspect of the game. And so I'm a bit of an outsider stepping on an unfamiliar territory because I'm trying to use the game to talk about other aspects, but I find myself constantly engaging with these very interesting aspects of how they played and the religious aspect of the practice of gaming.
Yeah, great.
I know
You have
we're
a
just a
question,
little
Hillary?
bit over time, yeah, but I thought I'd just quickly ask. It kind of goes back to what Alexa was asking about who's playing the game. Just based on the context where these things are found, do you find that they're more associated with sort of elite or more well-off sort of burial situations, or do we have evidence for these kinds of games in more sort of everyday, regular people context?
Thank you. I think that's a really important question because games overall are very, very democratic. So you could create the same game board, you know, by making lines in the sand. And we certainly have those popular versions of each and every one of these race games in antiquity. So the practice of playing a game was certainly common to all strata of society. Having said that, I do believe that these particular boxes are, in my view, they must have been part of even, I would say, the product of royal workshops. And it's interesting to think of them as such because they are made of bone. And in the history of scholarship, the use of bone was always thought to be second best next to ivory. And that's always been a huge part of the discussion, thinking of Levantine art in general, that they weren't using a lot of ivory in the Middle Bronze Age in the Southern Levant, and their products were somehow not as good as the ivory products around them. But I think that what we see here perhaps is that the bone was not just this affordable material, but also had a deep symbolic meaning. And this is somehow may explain why a royal workshop would create boxes using bone. And the Egyptian versions of the game boxes, the double game boxes that we saw, are very diverse. They're made of different colors of faience and all sorts of materials. And they're very playful in their color scheme. Whereas the Levantine game boxes are much more conservative, and we don't know, not even of specific inlays of different colors or materials. So we really have only the bone and obviously the wood that did not survive. So this sort of conservative approach may fit well with the procedure of a royal workshop that was interested in creating an artifact that is sort of potent religiously and perhaps class-wise. So these very modest-looking, humble objects, to my opinion, are elite objects.
That's really interesting. Thanks. Thanks for that answer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naeh, for a really interesting talk.